Hannah and I had always known the quiet life. Our farm in Nebraska was our little piece of heaven, surrounded by endless cornfields that whispered in the wind. Out here, the world seemed to stretch on forever, with nothing but land and sky for miles. The only other signs of life were our closest neighbors, Victor and James, who lived half a mile away in opposite directions. The isolation was comforting, a reminder that we were far removed from the chaos of the world. On an otherwise uneventful night in, we invited Victor and his wife over for drinks, as we often did. The four of us sat around our kitchen table, playing board games and sharing stories, our laughter filling the room. The hours slipped away, and before we knew it, it was past 11:30 p.m. Victor and his wife eventually called it a night, stumbling out into the dark, promising to do it again soon. With the house quiet again, Hannah and I poured ourselves another glass of wine and settled on the couch to watch one of our favorite movies. The soft patter of rain on the roof was soothing, and the warmth of the wine made us drowsy. We were content, ready to fall asleep right there, wrapped up in each other's arms, when a sound broke the peace. A knock at the door. I stood frozen by the door, Hannah's hand still gripping my arm like a vice. The muffled voice outside was getting more insistent, the knocks more frantic. "Please, we just need to use your phone," the man called out, his voice wavering. But something in the tone didn't sit right with me. It was too forced, too unnatural. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. I whispered to Hannah, "Call 911. She nodded, her face pale, as she fumbled for her phone. The voice outside called out again. "We're lost. We don't know where we are." But when I asked where they had come from, there was a pause. Too long of a pause. "Down the road," the man finally said, but the hesitation only deepened my suspicion. "My wife, she's hurt. Please just open the door." I asked once more, "Can she say something? Is she okay?" There was another silence, the kind that makes your skin crawl, before the voice responded, "She's not next to me right now." The words were slow, deliberate, like he was trying to think of what to say next. That was when the realization hit me. Whoever was out there wasn't telling the truth. Panic set in, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. "Victor, is that you?" I asked, hoping beyond hope that this was just some cruel joke. The voice got deeper. Yeah. That sent a chill down my spine. I knew it wasn't Victor, and I felt sick with fear. I grabbed my phone and dialed Victor, praying he'd pick up quickly. When he finally did, his voice was groggy, confused. "Are you at my door right now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His answer came back instantly. "No." "Why?" My blood ran cold as I told him what was happening. Victor's tone changed immediately, all traces of sleep gone. "Stay inside. I'm coming over. And I'm bringing my shotgun." As I hung up, Hannah was already on the phone with 911, her voice quivering as she explained the situation. I grabbed the shotgun from the closet, loading it with trembling hands. The knocks came again, harder, more desperate. "Just let us in," the voice demanded, but now it was darker, angrier, no longer trying to mask its intent. Hannah's voice broke as she told the dispatcher about the footsteps we could now hear moving around the house. The boards of our wooden deck creaked under the weight of multiple people, circling like predators closing in on their prey. One of them stopped at a window, testing it, trying to slide it open. Hannah screamed, "Leave us alone!" But the intruders didn't stop. The tension in the air was suffocating. I shouted through the door, "We have a gun! Get the hell out of here!" My voice was shaking, but it didn't matter. Whoever was out there wasn't deterred. They kept knocking, kept circling, their presence suffocating. It felt like an eternity before Victor finally arrived, pounding on the door and shouting for us to let him in. I rushed to unlock it, pulling him inside. He had his shotgun in hand, eyes wild with fear and determination. We stood there, backs to the door, listening to the footsteps retreat into the night, still unsure if they were truly gone or just waiting for another chance to strike. Hannah's voice was barely audible as she stayed on the line with the dispatcher, telling them that Victor was with us now, All we could do was wait, our home no longer feeling like the safe haven it had always been. After the officer left, the silence in our house was deafening. Hannah, Victor, and I sat in the living room, still clutching our shotguns, the adrenaline slowly draining from our bodies, leaving behind a cold, hollow feeling. The officer had assured us that they'd keep an eye out, but without any sign of the intruders, there wasn't much else they could do. The thought that they could be out there, somewhere in the darkness, watching us, made my skin crawl. Hannah broke the silence first, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if they come back?" Her words hung in the air, heavy with fear. None of us had an answer. We all knew the truth. The only thing that had kept those people out was our wooden door, flimsy and worn with age. If they had been more determined, or if Victor had arrived just a minute later, we might not be sitting here right now. That realization settled over us like a suffocating blanket, the what-ifs flashing through my mind in a relentless loop. The next morning, we wasted no time in making changes. Victor helped me install cameras around the property, covering every angle we could think of. The work was methodical, almost robotic, a way to push the fear aside, if only for a few hours. As we drilled and wired, I kept glancing at the fields surrounding our house, half expecting to see a figure lurking in the corn rows. But there was nothing, just the wind rustling the stalks. The cameras brought some comfort, but it was fleeting. That night, after Victor had gone home and Hannah had finally fallen asleep, I sat on the porch, shotgun across my lap, watching the monitor inside for any sign of movement. The darkness seemed thicker than usual, more oppressive, as if it were closing in on our little patch of land. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind set my nerves on edge. Weeks passed, and life slowly returned to normal, but the feeling of safety never truly came back. The isolation we had once cherished now felt like a double-edged sword. The vast, empty fields that had always made us feel free now seemed to stretch too far, too empty, too vulnerable. Out here, in the middle of nowhere, help was always far away, and that night had proven just how alone we really were. Even now, months later, I can't shake the memory of that voice, the way it shifted, trying to deceive us, the quiet knock at the door that shattered our peace. Sometimes in the middle of the night, I'll wake up, convinced I've heard it again. The faint echo of a plea for help, just outside in the door. I'll grab my shotgun and sit in the dark, waiting, listening, heart pounding, until the morning light creeps in and I can finally breathe again. I know Hannah feels it too, though she doesn't talk about it much. The way she jumps at sudden noises, the way she double-checks the locks every night. We don't have to say it. We both know things have changed. The farm is still our home. But it's not the safe haven it once was. The solitude we once loved now feels like a curse, a constant reminder of just how alone we are out here. And no matter how much time passes, I know one thing for certain. I'll never forget the sound of that knock at the door. In the summer of 2016, I agreed to watch over my grandparents' farm for a few nights while they took a short trip. It was supposed to be an easy gig, just me, the open fields, and some quiet time away from the city. I'd been there countless times before, and nothing ever happened. So I thought, why not make some extra cash while enjoying the peace and solitude? On the last night, everything was going as expected. I was sprawled out on the couch in the living room, mindlessly flipping through TV channels, when I heard a strange noise coming from outside. It sounded like it was coming from near the cornfield, just beyond the barn. At first, I brushed it off, thinking it was probably just a deer or some other animal. The farm was surrounded by woods, and it wasn't uncommon for wildlife to wander close. But then, I noticed something unusual. The cows, every single one of them, began to moo all at once. The sound was deafening, a chorus of distress that filled the night air. I knew the farm well enough to know this wasn't normal. Cows might moo now and then, but when they all start up together like that, it means something is very wrong. My heart started to race as I realized that whatever was out there had spooked the entire herd. Grabbing my coat, I headed to the closet, where I froze as a high-pitched scream, distinctly coming from a cow, echoed through the night. The sound sent a chill down my spine, but I couldn't just stay inside. I rushed upstairs to my grandpa's room, where he always kept a few guns under the bed. I grabbed his hunting rifle, loaded it, and made my way outside. The night was eerily quiet, except for the frantic mooing of the cows. Their cries were loud and desperate, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. When I reached the barn, I could see the animals were agitated, pacing in their stalls, eyes wide with terror. My gut told me something was very wrong. I walked through the barn, checking each stall, but it wasn't until I reached the inn that I noticed one was empty. A cow was missing. Suddenly, that same blood-curdling scream tore through the night again, this time coming from the direction of the cornfield. I felt my stomach twist with fear, but I knew I had to find out what was going on. As I stepped out of the barn and approached the cornfield, something even more unsettling reached my ears. Voices, faint but unmistakably human. Panic surged through me, and without thinking, I fired 2 shots into the air. The sound echoed across the farm, and for a moment everything went silent. The cows, the voices, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. But then, from within the cornfield, I heard footsteps. Multiple sets, crunching through the dry stalks. I tightened my grip on the rifle and took a deep breath. I had no choice but to investigate. The footsteps continued as I entered the field, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The tall corn surrounded me, blocking out the moonlight and creating a maze of shadows. The further I ventured, the louder the footsteps grew, until they were all around me, echoing in the darkness. Then, up ahead, I saw him, a figure standing just a few feet away, dressed in all black. He was facing me, but I couldn't see his face, only the outline of his body in the dim light. I raised my rifle and aimed it directly at him, shouting for him to get out of my field. But he didn't move. He just stood there, unnervingly still. I fired another shot into the air, hoping to scare him off, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he started walking towards me, his arms slightly raised as if in surrender, but there was something menacing about his slow, deliberate movements. That's when I noticed the others, 6, maybe 7 figures, all dressed in black, emerging from the corn around me. They were closing in, surrounding me, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I was trapped. My hands shook as I tried to keep my rifle steady. The man closest to me stopped just a few feet away, and for a moment they all stood there, staring at me in complete silence. Then, in unison, they began to chant, their voices low and rhythmic, like some twisted ancient hymn. The sound was hypnotic, sending waves of dread through my entire body. I couldn't understand the words, but the malevolence in their tone was unmistakable. This was no ordinary trespassing. It was something far darker, something ritualistic. My survival instincts kicked in, and without waiting to see what would happen next, I turned and ran as fast as I could through the cornfield, the eerie chanting still echoing in my ears. I bolted, running as fast as I could through the cornfield, not caring where I was going, just needing to escape. The sound of my own breath and pounding heart filled my ears as I pushed through the tall stalks. When I was sure I had put some distance between myself and those terrifying figures, I stopped, my chest heaving. I raised my rifle and fired 6 rounds into the darkness, hoping to scatter them, to drive them away. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, faintly, I heard rustling and the sound of footsteps moving away from me. Relief washed over me, but I knew I wasn't safe yet. I turned and sprinted back toward the farmhouse, desperate to put this nightmare behind me. As I reached the edge of the field, I stumbled into a clearing, and what I saw nearly made me collapse in terror. There, in the middle of the clearing, was the severed head of the missing cow. It was placed on the ground, surrounded by a circle of candles that flickered eerily in the night. The sight was grotesque, the blood still fresh and pooling around the candles. My stomach twisted, and I felt bile rise in my throat. I stumbled back, my legs shaking, and somehow managed to make it to the farmhouse. Inside, I grabbed the house phone with trembling hands and dialed 911. My voice shook as I tried to explain to the operator what had happened. She assured me that officers were on their way, but every second until their arrival felt like an eternity. I huddled in my grandpa's room, the rifle still in my lap, my mind racing with fear and confusion. What kind of people had I encountered? What did they want? The only thing I knew for sure was that they weren't ordinary trespassers. Finally, the sound of a police car pulling up outside snapped me out of my daze. I rushed outside, feeling a wave of relief as I saw the flashing lights. The officer listened patiently as I recounted the night's events, his expression growing more serious with every word. He searched the barn and part of the cornfield, and when he came back, his face was grim. He had found the cow's head, just as I described. It was no longer just a bizarre encounter. It was now an active crime scene. My parents arrived not long after, their faces pale with worry. The officer explained the situation to them as best he could, but there were no real answers. This wasn't something that could be easily explained. My grandparents, who had been so kind to let me stay at their farm, were devastated. They took immediate action, installing a high-tech security system across the property, but the damage was already done. The farm, once a place of peace and comfort, now felt tainted, as if those dark rituals had left a permanent stain. As for me, the experience left me deeply scarred. The memory of those masked figures and their twisted ritual haunts me to this day. I still don't know what they were or what they were trying to do, but one thing is certain. I was just the unlucky one, the one who happened to be home alone on the night they chose our farm for their dark, incomprehensible purposes. And that night will forever be etched into my mind as the night I came face to face with true evil. My name is Anthony, and I'm 23 years old. I live on my family's farm, a modest piece of land tucked away in the middle of Missouri. It's the kind of place where the days blend together, where the most exciting thing that happens is when a cow escapes the pasture or when the crops finally start to sprout. My parents have spent their whole lives here, and they expect me to take over one day since I'm the oldest of their 3 children and the only son. But the truth is, I've never really seen myself staying here forever. The farm life isn't for me. I've always wanted more excitement, more adventure, more of anything than this quiet, predictable life. That feeling only got stronger last June when my parents decided to go on a week-long romantic getaway. They left me in charge of the farm and my 2 younger sisters, Crystal and Morgan. It wasn't the first time I'd been left to take care of things, but it was the first time I felt the weight of the responsibility. There's a lot of privacy out here, sometimes too much. And that isolation took on a different, more unsettling tone when my parents weren't around. The days went by uneventfully, but something changed as the week drew to a close. Something strange happened that made me rethink everything I thought I knew about this place. What started as just another quiet night on the farm quickly turned into something I still can't fully explain. Looking back, that night was the beginning of the end for me, the moment I knew for sure that I needed to leave this place behind for good. That night started off like any other. Crystal was holed up in her room, working on her college courses, while Morgan and I were in the living room, half watching some dumb show on TV. The only sounds were the muffled voices from the TV and the occasional creak of the old farmhouse settling in the night. It was so quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel like something is about to happen. Then, out of nowhere, the dogs went berserk outside. Their barking echoed through the night, sharp and frantic, a clear sign that something wasn't right. My first thought was that it might be an animal, a coyote maybe, or worse, a trespasser. We've had a few people try to steal crops before, but nothing ever serious. Still, my heart started racing as I stood up to check it out. I stepped outside into the cool night air, the darkness pressing in around me. The dogs were facing the cornfield, barking like their lives depended on it. That's when I heard it, a faint, eerie whistling coming from deep within the corn. It was unmistakably human, a slow, almost taunting tune that sent a chill down my spine. I wasn't used to dealing with this kind of thing without my dad around. And for a moment, I felt completely out of my depth, but I knew I had to do something. I ran back inside, grabbed one of the guns we kept for emergencies, and told my sisters what was happening. Crystal and Morgan both looked at me like I was crazy. When I mentioned going into the cornfield, they were right, of course. The idea of wandering into those dark, narrow rows with someone or something hiding in there was terrifying. Instead, I took the safer route. I went back outside, raised the gun, and fired a shot into the air. The blast was deafening, and the dogs immediately went quiet. For a few tense moments, the night was still again, and I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. We all laughed, nervously, thinking the worst was over. But just as we started to relax, the dogs went wild again, their barking even more frantic than before. I rushed back outside, my heart pounding in my chest. And that's when I saw him. A man standing at the edge of the cornfield, his figure barely visible in the darkness. He was just standing there, staring at me, not moving a muscle. The sight of him made my blood run cold. I shouted at him, my voice breaking the tense silence, and in an instant, he turned and bolted back into the corn, disappearing into the shadows. Every instinct in me screamed to chase after him, but I knew better. There was no way I was going into that field, not with the memory of that whistling still ringing in my ears. I quickly brought the dogs inside and locked every door and window in the house. We called our dad, hoping he'd know what to do. His voice was calm, but I could hear the concern underneath. He told me I needed to protect my sisters, and that if the guy came back, another warning shot might scare him off for good. But as I hung up the phone, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. I went to bed with the gun lying next to me, too spooked to sleep. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside, sent a jolt of anxiety through me. I tried to distract myself, putting on a movie on my laptop, but my eyes kept darting to the open window, half expecting to see something or someone out there. And then I heard it again, the whistling. That same eerie tune floating through the night air. My heart started pounding in my chest as I scrambled to the window. There, in the faint moonlight, I saw him, walking slowly through the grass like he was taking a midnight stroll. But there was nothing casual about it. This guy knew exactly what he was doing, and he must have sensed me watching because he suddenly stopped dead in his tracks and turned to look straight at my window, still whistling that haunting melody. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. This wasn't just some random trespasser or a kid pulling a prank. This was something else, something darker. The way he stared at me, unblinking, made my skin crawl. He was toying with us, enjoying the fear he was stirring up. I wasn't about to let him keep doing it. I grabbed the gun and aimed it out the window, my hands trembling. I fired a shot into the grass, just a few feet away from where he stood. The sound was deafening, shattering the quiet of the night. He stopped whistling immediately, his head snapping back to where the bullet had landed. For a split second, we locked eyes, and then he bolted, disappearing into the shadows around the side of the house. I didn't sleep at all that night, my mind racing with thoughts of who this guy could be and what he wanted. When morning finally came, the fear hadn't left me. My sisters and I searched the property, every corner of it, but we found nothing. No footprints, no signs of a break-in, nothing to prove that someone had been there at all. It was like he had vanished into thin air. We never found out who he was or why he was there. Maybe it was just some kids messing around, trying to scare the local farm kids for a thrill. Or maybe it was something worse. Something we were lucky to have escaped from. All I know is that after that night, the farm never felt the same to me. The open fields and the quiet nights, once comforting, now felt suffocating and filled with unseen threats. That was the moment I knew for sure. Farm life wasn't for me. I couldn't spend the rest of my life out here, wondering if every strange sound in the night was just the wind, or something far more sinister,